Nurses of Reddit, what were the most haunting things someone said on their deathbed? Story 1. I had a patient whose memory had been fading for years. It's weird, right before a patient dies, sometimes they'll suddenly be doing a lot better. Anyway, he thought I was his late wife, so I played along and just listened to him while he recalled his engagement, his wedding, his first childbirth, and a few other memories for me. At one point, he says, "Oh, Irene, there you are. Sorry, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. Well, thank you for listening to an older man tell his stories. I hope you have great stories to tell one day, too. I'm coming, Irene." And then he passed. He was my first longtime patient. Story 2. Many months ago, when I was a nursing student, a man in his 40s was lying on his deathbed from terminal cancer, his sobbing wife lying in bed next to him. He looked at his wife, using the last bit of energy he had to wipe away her tears and stroke her cheek gently. He took off his oxygen mask and said, "Don't worry, love. Don't be afraid. It's just death," and passed away shortly after. Story 3. When I was 16, I worked as a dietary aide in a lovely nursing home. There was this one older gentleman whom I become pretty good friends with. He always talked about World War II and how he had lost so many guys in his company. Several days in a row, I noticed that he wasn't coming to the dining room for lunch or dinner. I went to his room to check on him, and he wasn't there. The nurse said he had a spell and fell out of his bed. His doctor wanted him to go to the hospital for observation. What had happened was that he had a stroke. He returned to the nursing home about a week later and couldn't remember anyone except me. We talked the day after he returned, and he told me he wasn't doing well. He knew his time was coming to a close. He said it was time for him to pay for all the horrible things he had done when he was over in Europe. He wasn't religious, but he asked me where I thought he was going. I said to bed because it was getting close to lights out. He said, "No, Joe, my name is Mike. I mean, up or down. I'm not a religious person." But I said, "Martin, that's not for me to say." He laughed and said, "I know where I'm going. There's only one place for people who have done what I've done. I've killed so many people, Joe. Most of the time, it didn't matter who it was. We went into buildings, just shooting. There's only one place for me. It's what I deserve." I had absolutely nothing to respond with. When I say that experience shook me to the core, I mean it. That man's face is burned into memory because of that conversation. He passed away the next day. His son said he kept asking where Joe was at. I quit that day. Working in a nursing home is a haunting place. It takes a particular type of person to be able to watch people die around you. Story 4. I treated a man in his 90s who was a DNR DNI at least once a week. When I would go to his room to start our sessions, he would cry and say, "I didn't want to kill the kids." Finally, after speaking to his nurse, it was revealed that he had killed children in World War II. He collapsed during the session and said, "The kids are here to get me." Unfortunately, he died a few minutes later. Story 5. About 2 minutes before my grandma passed, she had clarity. She had severe dementia for years. She opened her eyes and said, "I found Jack. My grandpa died 8 years prior." She said they were all at a ball with their friends. Then she said, "I've got to go. He asked me to dance." Then she was gone. Story 6. My great-uncle's last words before he passed were, "It is what it is." I know it's expected, but I find myself saying it quite a lot nowadays. It is what it is. My great-aunt lived to be 101 and was straight vegetative for like a month or so before passing, the day after her 101st birthday. On the day of her birthday, she suddenly was conscious and awake as everybody had come to leave a birthday cake. She told stories and laughed. Then she went back to being comatose and died the next day. Story 7. We had an ex-gang guy who died of cancer and confessed to being the gang hitman for many years. He wanted to admit to all the killings and show the police where the bodies were buried. He would get closure knowing that the surviving families of his victims found out where they were buried. He had to involve the hospital legal team because we had no policies to deal with that. Cops got involved and the dude confessed to gang murders decades ago. Story 8. I worked in private practice. I had a patient diagnosed with moderately aggressive but treatable throat cancer. We tried everything we can think of to get him to consider treatment. He refused treatment. So after about 3 months, his wife had their 2 adult sons carry him into the office at 4:50 p.m. on a Friday. I was the only nurse in the building. I got him to an exam room. The dude was gray and gaunt, and you could hear how close to the end he was every time he breathed. It wasn't exactly a death rattle, but you knew his lungs were full of fluid. His sons sit him in a chair, and he starts to slide out. The room was too small to put him on the floor, and the exam table was too high to lift him. So I stood between his legs and held him upright in the chair while I told the sons to get the doctor, and told the wife to call 911. We all knew nothing was going to keep the man alive much longer. Finally, he patted the side of my leg. It was the most he could move, and whispered, "I should have listened to y'all. I don't want to die." Then he lost consciousness, and all I could do was keep him from sliding out of the chair until the EMTs got there. After the ambulance got him to the hospital, he lasted about 4 hours. Story 9. I had to tell my grandmother that dialysis would only give her another week or so to live, and it was her choice to try or not. She was in and out of consciousness at that point, and was in a clear state for the moment. Finally, she asked, "Will I die?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me in the eye, smiled a little, and said, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." She closed her eyes, squeezed my hand, and slept until she passed a day later. When things get hard, I hear her say, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." Story 10. Looked after a guy with end-stage heart failure. He kept having episodes where if he coughed or leaned forward, anything to increase his intrathoracic pressure, he would pass out. He would return after a few minutes and gradually go from purple to pink. How long was I out for that time? He was mentally nuanced, sharp, witty, and at peace with what would eventually happen to him. He and I were joking that one of these episodes would kill him as he sipped his tea, and we talked rubbish. 5 minutes later, it happened again. And he didn't come back. He had a DNR order, which was sensible. Very eerie to talk to somebody so vibrant and alert minutes before he died. Such a nice dude. I want to be in that mindset when I go too. Story 11. My grandfather was put into a 24/7 care home with severe Parkinson's. My mom and grandma had spent 4 years taking care of him constantly, and I needed a break for a couple of weeks. I went one day alone, and he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I need you to get me home so I can die. I can't do it here." I tried saying everything I could to the nurses and my family to get him home without saying what he told me. 24 hours later, he got rushed to the emergency. As he was dying, he looked at me and said, "Don't let it bother you," and broke. Story 12. One of my 26-year-old patients got into a car accident and was on a ventilator. He was brain dead. We were waiting for the family to arrive to say their goodbyes. He got into a car accident while driving to visit his girlfriend in another city. His fiancée and girlfriend were at his bedside. Yet another girlfriend showed up and was pregnant. His dad knew everything, so he ensured the harem came in to say their goodbyes. Story 13. I started my nursing career in the palliative unit. In my first 3 months as RN, I pronounced 7 deaths. This one patient had advanced dementia and often believed he was at work while he was awake in the hospital. He often gave us, the nurses and care aides, tasks and jobs as he believed himself to be our superior. One day, the end of December, he asked me, "When is New Year?" "What day is it this year?" I tell him that New Year will be the upcoming Tuesday. He nods and tells me he thinks he'll have to quit after the New Year. This job is getting too difficult for him, and he can't keep up. It's time to retire. I tell him we appreciate all the work he's done, and that we'll miss him terribly when he's gone. That he was a great employee, and that we all loved working with him. That Tuesday, January 1st, he passed peacefully in his sleep at 0200. I'll never forget that conversation.